Hi, everybody. Kristin here with a quick word about referrals and endorsements. The Straight Spouse Network does not make referrals to individual therapists, counselors, or other mental health programs, and does not make recommendations for any other professional services. However, if you are part of a face-to-face group, or you have been connected with a volunteer contact in your community, your volunteer may have personal recommendations for those resources. Also, the Straight Spouse Network does not recommend, represent, or endorse any particular product, publication, service, or individual, including those featured on the Straight Spouse Voices podcast. That being said, sometimes our guests on the podcast have written a book, or created a website, or teach a class or a workshop geared toward the straight spouse experience. While the Straight Spouse Network does not endorse any of these products, services, or people, we interview these guests because they have compelling stories to tell or expertise to share, and we feel it's important for our listeners to know that resources are out here for you, and for you to make your own decisions about whether or not you want to buy that book, or visit that website, or participate in a workshop if it resonates with you. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of the Straight Spouse Network podcast, Straight Spouse Voices. I'm your host, Kristin Kalbli, and I am a straight spouse. Our guest today is Kimberly Brooks Mazella. Kim is a psychotherapist in McLean, Virginia. Kim's first marriage ended in 1987 when her husband came out as gay. Since then, she has worked to support straight spouses, their partners, and families in coming to terms with their new and often challenging reality. Kim recently founded the Straightforward Project, a 501c3 charitable organization that serves as an information and educational resource for straight spouses, their family and friends, and interested professionals. Welcome to the podcast, Kim. It's so great to have you here today.
Hi, Kristin. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, you're welcome. It's a pleasure. So, Kim, I've known you for a little while now, and you are a straight spouse. I'm wondering if you would share with our listeners your personal straight spouse story.
Absolutely. Mine's an old one because I got married in 1985. I met my husband the year before, right after I'd finished my master's degree. And I met him on a blind date. And I remember this very tall, prematurely silver-haired, very handsome man. He was about 6'2", I'm about 5'2". And we shook hands and I looked him in the eye and my gut said, he's gay. Now, mind you, back in the 80s, I didn't really know many gay folks or know that I knew many gay folks. And so I wasn't really sure what to make of that. But as we were dating, I actually asked him, and he said that he had wondered at one time, but that he was not. And around the same time, Elton John actually had gotten married, and I had always thought he was gay too.
Oh, wow.
And in fact, he is, but he was married for a period of time. So thinking back 30 years, and I'm in my late 20s and sort of naive, I thought it would be okay. So we were married for a couple years, and then I discovered that he was having a relationship with the man that he's now been married to, actually. They've been together for, as I said, about 30 years. And my marriage ended that day.
May I ask you how you found out? What did you discover?
He started spending time with a guy that I had never heard of before. It wasn't one of his friends. And he would talk about him a lot and talk about this guy and his girlfriend. And when I would say, well, gee, we should have them over for dinner, or it just never happened. And so I started getting suspicious. And so one day I just asked, is Stan gay, his partner? And he said, I don't know. And that was the moment that I knew that he was and that they were involved.
Mm. So did he at any point come clean or come out with the truth, or how did that happen?
He did. My ex-husband is a man of just a force of nature. He really has a very strong personality, strong character, and he did come clean and kind of almost immediately started living pretty openly. He's an attorney with a large national law firm, and when he came out of the closet, he stepped out with strength and he stepped out with confidence. And so he didn't play any sort of games with me. As I've gotten to know so many other straight spouses over the years, I really have recognized that what I went through, even though it was obviously very painful, it was a lot easier than what some other folks experience.
What's your relationship like now with your ex? Did you have children together, or are you still in contact?
We did not have children together. We were just talking about it when I realized that he was involved with somebody. So we stayed close for quite a while after that. But, life goes on and he has a completely different life. So we may exchange emails every couple of years. But no, I wouldn't say we're in close contact, but we're friendly. It's amicable, but we just have different lives.
How did that experience impact you?
So on the one hand, I was completely devastated and very depressed and very sad for a long time. And at the same time, I almost maybe within 2 years started running therapy groups for other straight spouses once I identified that there were other straight spouses, because I didn't know that initially. And I also started working with the gay community. I started leading a support group for men who are HIV positive, because one of the ways that my experience really did change me is I had at the time and have still a lot of compassion for my ex-husband. I don't agree with what he did. I wish he had figured it out sooner before he married me, but just in terms of why he was closeted and the pain that he went through personally, I really did discover sort of a depth of compassion in myself that I'm not sure I would have known about otherwise. So, at the end of the day, wish I hadn't gone through it, but there were certainly some very positive things that came out of it. So I did start working with straight spouses in a therapeutic setting, my private practice within a couple of years, and have been doing that ever since about 1990.
I really want to talk to you about the founding of the Straightforward Project, which is your latest endeavor, which is not in any way affiliated with the Straight Spouse Network, but it's a brand new endeavor that you've launched, a 501c3 organization. Can you tell us a little bit about the Straightforward Project?
It's funny to hear you say it's a brand new endeavor, because it's been in my brain probably since the mid 90s. I've certainly been using the title straightforward in my work since that time. And I wasn't sure exactly how it was going to manifest, what I wanted to do with it. But over the last couple of years, I think I got really clear on what I want it to look like. So I recently, yes, incorporated, and I became a 501c3, which for folks who don't know what that is, it's a nonprofit status that's granted by the IRS. And it's considered to be a public charity. And so the point of the Straightforward Project is to offer services to the community, and not just the straight spouse community, but also providing resources. I want to train therapists. So when a straight spouse goes into a therapist's office, the therapist gets it, understands the experience. I also want to help folks who are coming out of the closet, who are married, and try and make that transition as, I don't want to say painless as it can be, because it can't be, but certainly less traumatic than it has been for a lot of us. So the Straightforward Project, has been around, and in my conversations and in my my thoughts, and God knows the number of legal pads that I have with notes on them. But as of May 15th, I am officially a thing.
Well, congratulations on that. And I do want to say how needed that work is in the space with therapists and working with clinicians and other professionals. I can't tell you how many times I have heard from other straight spouses that they've gotten into a therapy or counseling situation and the therapist just did not get it. That said, I know that you have conducted some survey research recently, and that is really one of the main reasons I want to have you on today, is because I know some of your findings are absolutely fascinating. And we're going to actually go to a quick break, and then we're going to come back and I'm going to ask you, Kimberly, about your survey results.
That sounds great, because I'm really excited to talk about it.
I am too. Okay, we'll be back in just a moment. Hey everyone! The Straight Spouse Network is currently in need of volunteer contacts and facilitators for the following regions: Richmond, Virginia, West Virginia, and the Dakotas. That's the North one and the South one. Volunteers may serve as either contacts or group facilitators for new straight spouses in need of peer-to-peer support. If you are interested in serving as a volunteer contact for one of these regions, please email lovatoj@gmail.com. That's levatoj@gmail.com. All right, and we're back with Kimberly Brooks Mazella. And Kimberly, I know that you have done some fascinating research with straight spouses, a survey, as a matter of fact. Can you tell us more about that?
Sure, I would be happy to. I did a survey back in March, an online survey of over 700 straight spouses, which is just an incredible sample group. I don't think I've seen numbers that high before, so it gave us a lot of good information.
That is incredible. 700 people. That's a huge sample size. What did you learn from the survey?
A couple quick, just demographic things. Most of us were married between the ages of 22 and 30. And our marriages lasted between less than 1 year and up to almost 50 years.
Wow. Okay, so it really runs the gamut. Just like a normal marriage, they can be short and they can be long.
That's exactly right. 77% of us have college or graduate degrees. 62% of us learned that our spouse was gay through discovering texts or finding porn, or even in some cases, hiring a private investigator. So for 62%, it was a complete shock and just a real shock to the system, I would say. So one of the questions I asked was, did you experience any type of abuse during your marriage? And I clarified it. For example, emotional abuse, I said name calling, gaslighting, disparagement, threats of harm, intimidation, rejection, or guilt. Almost 60% identified themselves as having been emotionally abused. But at the same time, 42% said no abuse at all.
So it's not quite 50-50, but there definitely is a majority of straight spouses in the survey who identified some form of emotional abuse. And we were talking earlier off the podcast about compassion. You were saying something to the effect that you realize that compassion is not always possible in some situations where there's emotional abuse identified.
That's exactly right. I was reading an article the other day about forgiveness. And at the end of the article, the person said, we don't have to forgive other people. And I thought that was really profound. And I think that, especially in cases where a person has been terribly, terribly hurt, having permission to not forgive can be very liberating.
I agree 100%. And I think that is a profound sort of allowance, and especially since there's so much pressure and cultural pressure around forgiveness. And we talk about this in another podcast coming up, another episode, where there's just this culture of forgiveness around, if you don't forgive, then you're not spiritual enough or mature enough or healed enough or whatever the narrative is. And that's such a wonderful point that you make. What else did you find out in the survey? I know there's so much fascinating stuff.
Well, there is, and there are a couple of things that I think are just really significant in terms of moving forward and doing additional research on straight spouses. One is that a significant number of us experienced sexual abuse prior to the age of 18.
Like how significant? Like more than the average normal population?
Absolutely. Actually, among women, it was more than double the national average. And among our straight spouse men, it was more than 4 times the national average.
Wow. That is absolutely a shocking statistic. And how would you even identify what further research to do on that?
Well, to me, as a therapist, it speaks to some of the issues that we bring to the table. I mean, everybody is different, but there's certainly some commonalities. And so when you come from a trauma background, you're going to be more prone to things like boundary violations and, not having strong boundaries, maybe a certain passivity, maybe not recognizing red flags, because If you have been violated by somebody that you trust prior to the age of 18, you might not recognize the signs of somebody who doesn't have your best interests at heart.
That is such a brilliant point. I can certainly relate to the red flag situation. My therapist 10 years ago after my divorce said that I had a problem with making red flags pink. And I was just really trying to be very nice to my ex-husband. He might not agree with that assessment, but I was really trying to be very accepting and very compassionate and having lots of allowance. And meanwhile, I was making lots of red flags pink, according to my therapist. So, and I certainly do have some trauma in my, not sexual trauma, but trauma in my background as well in my adolescence and youth. So, okay, what else did you find in this absolutely fascinating survey, Kim?
I found that as a group, we are, contrary to popular belief, including our own, we are not sexually naive as a group. As many people had 6 or more sexual partners prior to marriage, as did 0. And I think there is a mythology that we are naive, we're inexperienced, and that's why, we can get into these marriages with somebody who's not as sexually intimate as we would like. But, 700 people say that we're pretty equally divided in terms of the number of sexual partners that we've had.
Okay, that's a really fascinating statistic too. So it's just as likely that you may be, like in my case, because I was 17 when I met my ex-husband and 19 when we started dating, that I was relatively inexperienced when we got together. But it's just as likely that a straight spouse would have multiple partners and presumably multiple heterosexual partners and have experienced heterosexual sex with other people before they ended up in their marriages with their gay spouse. So that doesn't, would you say that doesn't necessarily end up being a factor then in whether or not we end up in mixed orientation marriages?
Well, I guess what I would say is perhaps it's a factor for the folks on, well, actually, I'm thinking out loud now. Perhaps it's a factor for the people on the lower end,
Mm.
but also if you have a very high number of sexual partners, I'm just hypothesizing, but it's possible that you don't know that not you, what a person doesn't necessarily know what sexual intimacy is. And therefore, if you've had multiple partners, it would be easy to get into a marriage where you do not have sexual intimacy. Does that make sense?
It does, because intimacy is different than quantity of sexual partners, whether it's on the low end or on the high end.
That's exactly right. Intimacy is about a deep connection.
Correct. And so if we have trouble identifying intimacy in any capacity, we might miss it with one, that we don't have it with one person, and we might miss it that we don't have intimacy with 10 people. That makes total sense. What else did you find in the survey?
Well, another finding is that a lot of us have a crisis of faith, and people who describe themselves as moderately devout after their divorce or after discovering that their partner is LGBT, left the church or became atheist or identified as a non-believer. So there was really kind of a large number of folks who had been pretty devout prior, but then lost faith afterwards.
So that's a really interesting statistic. So this experience really, would you say, kind of puts people in a bit of an existential questioning that what I believed before does not necessarily fit the way my life ended up, and that there's some reordering and reorganizing in terms of belief systems that happens after we discover we're in a mixed orientation marriage.
Well, absolutely that. And mixed in with that are folks who are encouraged to stay married by their churches, or getting into marriages with gay men, for example, and encouraged to do that by their churches. Um, Sometimes people are told by, say, a pastor or a trusted elder in the church that, you can't divorce is a sin, or you are going to ruin your husband's professional career. So there are some not helpful messages coming from people who represent the church. So it can be a spiritual crisis and also a crisis of like specific religion, if you will. I'm sort of making that distinction between spirituality and the church.
Of course. Yeah, that's a good distinction. Well, I want to continue to talk about the survey. We're going to take another quick break, and then we're going to come back and find out what we do with some of this information that we've found out, or what you're hoping happens with some of this information. So we'll take a quick break, and then we'll be right back with Kim. Hey, everyone. If you find the stories we bring you on the Straight Spouse Voices podcast compelling and comforting, and you want to hear more, please consider donating to the podcast to help keep us on the air. $100 will underwrite an entire episode, but $20 will keep our engineer, Brian, in ramen noodles for at least a month. Please consider donating to the podcast at weblink.donorperfect.com/voices. And thanks for your support. And we're back again with Kim. So, Kim, are there any other statistics from your survey that you want to highlight for our listeners?
The one that's important to me in particular as a psychotherapist is the mental health crisis that's created. Over 80% of straight spouses seek mental health treatment as a direct result of discovering that their spouse is gay or lesbian. And for many, many, many folks, mental health symptoms last more than 6 months post-discovery. So things like disturbed sleep, low self-esteem, unrelenting sadness, social isolation, all of those can last for well more than 6 months. I mean, for some folks, it can last for years because, people experience what we call complicated grief.
What is complicated grief?
We all experience grief when there's loss. But it's complicated when we, for example, don't feel support, or when we have grief that is disenfranchised, meaning that other people, society, or our friends and family don't feel that we're entitled to feel the way we feel. For example, somebody said to me when I was going through it, "Oh, you were only married 2 years? That's not a marriage." And so a comment like that can disenfranchise your grief, make you feel as if you don't have a right to it. And so that's one of the reasons that it can not resolve in there's an expected period of time that grief normally resolves. But I think for a lot of us, it is complicated by other factors. And so, yeah, it is complex trauma.
Oh, okay. I had not heard that term, complex grief, before. And that makes so much sense, that the idea that sometimes our grief can be disenfranchised by the people around us. And there's so many ways in which straight spouses, I think, have their grief disenfranchised, both by family and friends who think they should get over it sooner, or they should be done grieving like a normal divorce. I know there's no such thing as a normal divorce. And also societally, there's a great deal of pressure on straight spouses to not be angry, because if you're angry why would you be angry at a gay spouse? Because they can't help it that they're gay or LGBT or trans. And of course, that makes it true. But the one thing I say repeatedly is that we're still responsible for how we handle ourselves around being whatever it is that we are. We may not be able to help the fact, nor should we help the fact that we're LGBT, but we are still responsible for how we handle ourselves in our families, in our relationships, in our marriages. And so anger is a real emotion straight spouses have to grapple with, and they're often not allowed to have that, which I think complicates and then elongates the recovery process.
That's exactly right. That is complicated grief. And where it gets tricky is a person has to be able to hold two competing truths at the same time. So on the one hand, it is wonderful that our spouses have come out or were pushed out. And, if they're living authentic lives and they're happy and they're in relationships, we want that for everybody. We all deserve to live authentic lives. So that's my left hand up.
Right.
My right hand up, The other container is, and the deceit and the damage that is done to unsuspecting spouses who are married to closeted LGBT folks is real and it's valid and it's true. And both of those things coexist. But there's oftentimes such pressure to take, for one camp or the other, one side or the other, and you can't do that.
I appreciate that point so much, that oftentimes this requires us to hold two sort of conflicting truths in tension at the same time. It's not an either or circumstance where there's one clear victim. I often say sometimes that as straight spouses, we're the victims of homophobia too, that cultural and familial and religious homophobia has impacted our lives as well. And I appreciate that you said that. And having said that, I want to know a couple of things. What happens to this research now, Kim?
Well, first I have to write it up.
Yes.
There's so much to it. I mean, I asked so many questions that on my end, I really need to spend a lot of time slicing and dicing it. And then figuring out how I'm going to get it out there, because it addresses a lot of different aspects of the straight spouse experience. So it's sort of a work in progress, and I will have to keep you posted on that. But definitely, I really do think that I have just a wealth of information that folks can take and then drill down into a particular subject area, a particular issue that the survey touched on, and hopefully educate us all, do more research and really help folks understand. And I'm thinking mostly in the therapeutic community, but really understanding the straight spouse experience. And also, I think it will help us understand ourselves, if you will. For example, just the idea of understanding how perhaps a childhood trauma of some sort of abuse could have led us down this path. That's important information to have, and good information to take to a therapist and really process. So moving forward, we might make different choices.
I think you're doing such incredibly important work, Kim, and I wish we had more time to even drill down on some of these survey results and talk more in depth. I can see that this is just the tip of the iceberg, and that more research hopefully will come down the pike, and that your research will get out there. I want to switch gears just a little bit and talk about healing. You're involved in something coming up called the Summit, and I wanted to just touch base on that, find out what that is and what you're doing. You've done this survey, and then you're also working on trying to help straight spouses heal. What is the Summit?
Well, I'm not involved in the summit. I am the summit.
Yes.
Based on the number of hours that I have spent this year creating it. And I'm very excited about it, actually. And the summit is in some ways directly informed by the results of the survey. So I created a weekend. I hate to say it's a healing weekend, because it's, even though there are going to be therapists presenting, it's not therapy. But I have brought in some really top-notch mental health professionals, and who are also authors, to talk about grief, to talk about how the body holds stress, to talk about different ways of releasing stress and rewiring one's brain, because your brain does change when you're under tremendous stress. So the summit is a weekend of some really, I think, serious work. Hopefully there will be some fun work. I have some straight spouses presenting. You may be familiar with a couple of them, because we have just quite a talent pool in our group.
Well, and full disclosure here, I myself am going to be co-facilitating a conversation at the summit with Aideen Fanola, the author of My Exquisite Purple Life, around recovering a sense of sex and sexuality for women post divorce from a mixed orientation marriage. And I won't be there in my capacity as the podcast host of the Straight Spouse Network, but just there in my capacity as a straight spouse. And I'm paying all my own travel expenses to volunteer to be there. And I understand, and just to be clear for our listeners, how much money are you making off of this thing, Kim?
Oh my goodness, I'll tell you what. This is the first time I've really put together a conference like this, and You know what? I've got a great working group helping me of great women. And a very first meeting, we joked about sort of the villa at Lake Como in Italy that I'm going to buy with all the money that I'm making from this,
With all the money you
because
make.
there is no money to be made. That's the point of a
Right.
nonprofit.
Right.
And the Straightforward Project is sponsoring this. I am particularly grateful that my people like you and Adine, got some other folks, and the professionals. Claudia Conan is coming down from New York City. She's an author, she's a grief therapist, she's doing it pretty much on her own dime. A couple of colleagues that are presenting, Deborah Ross and Carolyn Wolfe. Deborah has written a book on neuroplasticity. They are donating their time. So this is just a lot of really talented, smart women coming together out of a sense of purpose and meaning and passion. That's where it comes from, and that is what it's about.
Oh, well, thank you so much. And if people are interested in finding out more about the summit or the Straightforward Project, where should they go?
The website is thestraightforwardproject.org.
Great. I appreciate you sharing all of that information with us, Kim, and the survey results, which I think are just absolutely profound and ultimately the beginning of the kind of research and information that we need to be looking at as far as sort of quantifying the straight spouse experience. You're doing new and cutting edge work, and we're so grateful for it, Kim. Thank you so much for being a guest on our podcast today. It's been a pleasure to have you. And thank you so much to all of our listeners out there. You guys are making us a really successful podcast. I want to say we're a handful of episodes in, and we are pushing 1,000 downloads, guys. This is phenomenal for a brand new podcast straight out of the chute. So please keep listening. Please keep giving us feedback. Please keep those donations rolling in so we can keep our engineer Brian in ramen noodles. And please remember, until next time, your voice matters.